Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Kamini Gadhok and I'm Chief Executive at the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists. I'd like to welcome you to this afternoon's webinar, which is around building a business case for adult speech and language therapy services. So, in terms of the panel, I'd like to present the following people: David Amos, Sue McCormick and Diane Payne. As you can see from the slides, you'll have an opportunity to read their job titles. I decided I wouldn't go through them in detail now. So David is going to start the webinar by talking about a theoretical framework to support you to consider how you would build a business case. And as part of his presentation, he will provide some helpful resources and tools. David will be followed by Sue and then Diane, who will have 10 minutes each on their experiences of influencing within their own organisations. The webinar is due to take place for 45 minutes, and there will be an opportunity for you to interact should you wish. You will see only your name and the names of the panellists in the list of participants, but do be aware that many others will be online too. The host will let you know how many via the chat stream. The host will also keep you updated throughout the event on any issues as they might arise. There is an opportunity for you to interact with us by using the Q&A button on the webinar software. This will help you to submit a question for the panel. You can submit a question at any time, and we will use any of the questions that come in to answer at the Q&A session at the end. We'd be grateful if you could address Q&A questions to all panellists so that other participants can see them too. If you do have any queries for the host, who is Kate, please do use the chat button, and I know some of you have already been using that, and that will help you to send an instant message, and again, you can do that at any time during the event. For those of you who have colleagues and friends who weren't able to join us this afternoon, just to let you know that the event is being recorded and will go online with the slides in about a week's time. And you can see on the slide in front of you the web link for that work. So without further ado, I'd like to pass over to David Amos. If colleagues could bear with us for a minute, sometimes it takes a little bit of time for the slides to be passed over to the next presenter.
Thank you very much, Kamini, and good afternoon, colleagues. Very pleased to be able to contribute to your important session on developing clinical business skills. I've got a collection of slides which I'll use over the next 10 minutes, which hopefully will give a taster to colleagues on the programme that we've been running for the last year and a half across the UK to promote greater understanding and influence and control amongst and by speech and language therapists, particularly when facing very significant service and financial challenge. And hopefully these slides will be useful for you to refer back to, as they are in some cases checklists once the information is available, as Kamini has indicated. So what I want to do is just really address 4 points: the challenges ahead, dealing with change, making the clinical business case, and then a few tips on building personal and team resilience. So let's start with the challenges ahead. This slide sums up, if it's possible, a very complex picture in terms of what's been going on since the war, in terms of how much government spends and how much it brings in. And that is something that won't have escaped your notice as a core topic since the financial crash 4 or 5 years ago. So the phase that we're now in is on the right-hand side of the slide, and the dark line is how much government spends or has been spending, and the lighter line at the bottom is what it gets in receipts. So when you hear ministers and others, commentators talk about a deficit, that means where, as you can see from sort of 08-09, a lot more being spent than we're bringing in. You'll see by 2018-19 that those two lines coincide to mean that there won't be a deficit. All of that has a very substantial impact on those of us working in the public service, whichever particular setting. A second slide just looks at the NHS. It's a picture that applies to many parts of the public sector. This is England. It's true for the UK as a whole. And the two lines to look at is the one which arcs up to the right, so the upper one, And this is the Nuffield Trust's estimate of how much the English NHS needs in terms of expenditure to meet growing demand over the next 4 or 5 years. The figure on the right at the top is about 120-30 billion. The one at the bottom, the flat line, is what is being forecast, perhaps a slight increase given some debate over the last year or so in terms of extra investment in the NHS. All of that means a major challenge to those of us clinicians and all working in the NHS and most of the public sector and public services. A quick slide really to introduce the concept of productivity. We do much more of that in the programme that we run supporting colleagues such as yourselves. But essentially, productivity is the one to aim for. How much more care, how many more patients, how many more clients can we treat at a certain level of quality? So it's not just processing people through the system, and that's where productivity comes in. And this is a view of the NHS as a whole over the last 5 years or so. And essentially, you measure productivity improvement, which would be the green line, in terms of how much you're putting in as in input and how much you're getting out. And clearly you want to get more out compared to what you're putting in. One of the challenges clearly in a situation where there won't be significant financial growth in the public services over the next few years is what that means for the size of the workforce. Speech and language staff, this is a picture of England. It's pretty similar across the UK as a whole. The red line is the numbers of speech and language therapists working in the English NHS, and the blue one is when converted into a whole-time equivalent, so 37.5 hours a week. So you can see a bit of flattening out 3 or 4 years ago, slightly increase in the last year or so. So what the challenge is how much more productive can that workforce be if we can't rely on more staff, which is how it's been over the last 10 years, in order to deliver improved quality and more effective activity. So what we've found as we've gone around the country, whatever setting, is that people face very similar challenges. This list can be read and used in any setting: social justice, education, public and private sector. And we've used this to try and work through with colleagues in terms of what it is that you're facing and how can we provide support. All of it tends to come down to, and you'll hear more from colleagues in a second, how to develop and make a clinical business case. So we've got a checklist here of the sorts of things that we ask colleagues to think about in terms of what they think their organisation could be planning. A lot of change happens overnight sometimes and lands on people's lap, and we provide a lot of support for colleagues to help them deal with change as it hits them. But the better position to be in clearly is trying to spot what your organisation could be doing and being prepared for that. I've got a couple of checklists here in terms of dealing with change, which I said I'd refer to. I quite like this one, which is the sort of things that individuals say when they face change. Some of them get stuck on the first one. Some make their way through these feelings. In particular, I think that applies where people feel they've got the ability to understand why a change is being designed, to be able to influence it, and therefore get control, whether it's service development, changing the way people work, building new teams. And I think the real challenge for managers and leaders, particularly clinical ones, is how to get engaged and lead staff through all those sorts of feelings, which I'm sure you recognise, if not in yourself, but other colleagues who face change. I'm often asked, how do employers react to change? Been on a couple of trust boards myself. Might not be as people think. For employers, it often feels that something is being done to them by the system. One of the big challenges is at what point to go live with consultation. Do you start very early, which is everyone's instinct, but without much details, which can be pretty scary for people who hear about change and don't know the details to work out how it might impact them? Or do you go later with more details and be vulnerable to criticism that the consultation is too late? And I think the other thing that organisations sometimes get stuck on is when they're facing major change, particularly when it's immediate, is really trying to catch their breath and work out how significant that change is and what the options are, which is why often employees and staff hear about the potential for change, but it can be some while before the organisation comes up with proposals. What the Vice President of the US said, when you've got a crisis, why waste it? So why not achieve a whole lot of change, particularly if it's good for patients and clients. We've got a list of clinical business language. My third section in terms of developing the clinical business case, won't go through all the details here. The sort of thing we've been able to help colleagues across the service in whatever setting, is encouraging people to use the language, because this is the language that organizations use when thinking through how to design, develop and implement change. A couple of slides here that you can refer back to perhaps at a later stage, which is what the organization is focused on, at least ideally, when it comes to working out how to be more productive. So that's looking at what I call spare capacity. It may not be spare capacity now with everyone running around madly, very busy, working more than their contracted hours. But how can capacity be identified, new teams, information technology, new ways of working in order to generate additional revenue, reduce spend elsewhere, enhance the quality of the service, and potentially, if none of those three can be done, to make that redundant. And you can see on this slide a check of all the sort of classic things that organizations, and you can think about in your own areas when thinking through making the clinical business case, and the sorts of things that you might be able to contribute to. Got a list here that I use with colleagues across the service in terms of the sorts of information that I would ideally like when working with services to get underneath what the opportunities are. So this is quite a useful thing to have in your back pocket, particularly if you're not being asked for it now. So you've got the data and information, which I think puts you in a very powerful position when making the clinical business case for dealing with the challenges that I've referred to. And the mantra that we've started to coin across the Royal College when thinking about developing new skills, extended responsibilities, what do I do that only I can do? And that's particularly important in terms of the specialist role. What do I do that someone else can do, either within the profession or elsewhere? And what do others do that I could do? And I think that helps come up with a practical program. So looking at the team as a whole, which isn't just members of the Royal College, speech and language therapists, but others, teachers, medical staff, and those who have a role in terms of parents and guardians and volunteers, thinking of the whole team in terms of how best to deliver a high quality clinical service. And just a couple of slides here. I haven't got that time, we might come back to it in the discussion, but one of the things we've been promoting is advanced job planning, and you'll be able to refer back to these two slides in terms of how to make the case for the specialist contribution, which is crucial, obviously, in terms of what you provide across education, social justice, and so forth, and thinking through the quantum of time that you spend on direct clinical care and the other things that you do in order to make that happen. Advanced job planning. So my final two slides is just a couple of checklists that you can refer to. Crucial for dealing with change, because it's easy to talk about it, but change can be very challenging, and particularly if you're a clinical leader in terms of what that might mean for yourself, let alone the people that you're leading. So a couple of checklists that you can refer to here in terms of thinking through how to make sure that you're being looked after, and if you are in a clinical leadership position, how you can provide positive and general support to the people that you work with. Thanks very much.
Right, we're now going to pass to Sue McCormick, and as David said, we'll hopefully have a bit of time at the end to come back to some of those slides if need be, responding to a question that's already been submitted. To Sue then.
Thank you, Kamini, and good afternoon, everybody. I'm just going to share with you some of my personal experiences around a piece of work that I did around safe staffing, and perhaps go through some of the things that I considered in the hope that it might help you with future business cases. So a good starting point is to think about what are the drivers for writing your business case in the first place. In my situation, I was directly asked the question by the chief nurse as to whether AHP staffing levels were safe on our wards in the wake of Francis. So that was my opportunity to give quite a detailed answer. But you can't necessarily wait to be asked. So you need to be looking at what else is happening in your organisation. So perhaps, is there a service undergoing review, and is there something that you would be able to contribute to that? Or have you recently noticed a change in the trend in the data you collect that you might want to present? So you need to create an interest in your service and show what it is that you can contribute to patient outcomes. How much do you know about your organisation? This is really quite useful knowledge and information that you can use when planning what it is that you are going to present and who you're going to present it to. So in my organisation, we were tendering for new services. Quality and safety was quite high on the agenda. And we had a change in the top layer of our management as such. So we had a new chief exec, a new chief nurse and medical director. So in my eyes, it was an opportunity for fresh eyes. In terms of speech therapy, I'm sure my service, like many of yours, were facing similar things, and some of the things that David has already alluded to. So doing more with less, being more responsive, 7-day working was on the horizon, and of course there was SIP, which for many speech therapy budgets with little non-pay, there's not many ways to save it apart from staffing. And my final point on this slide was just to say that my paper was not a business case in the traditional sense of the word. So many of you will have templates in your organisations for writing business cases. So mine was not option appraisal was costed, but either way, I was still using business skills. And if you learn these skills, you can use them in many situations. You need to think about who you are writing your paper for, who is your audience. So in my case, it was the chief nurse, but it can be used, and my paper has been used since, with other people. So perhaps divisional directors, commissioners, etc. You need to use a business style format, as David has said, so use the language that they are familiar with. And your business case needs to speak to them, so they need to be interested. So you need to develop a shared understanding with your audience of the needs of adults with communication and swallowing problems. You might also take an opportunity to challenge any myths. So, for example, that speech therapists only work with people who've had a stroke. And as my audience was my trust, it was very important for me to know their visions and values and what was important to them. And I referred back to this a number of times in my paper. As regards service expectations, you need to know what it is that your trust wants you to do, or what you are commissioned to do. But I suspect, as in my case and in many adult services, that we have a very undefined service spec with no particular boundaries. So it's difficult to know what it is that they want you to do, in which case you might take the opportunity to say what it is that you think you should provide in that setting. And we know there will always be an expectation that you see patients. However, you need to show that in order to do that, for example, that you need to put training in place to deliver outcomes. You do need to align your service with the trust's expectations more broadly and what patients need within your setting. So, for example, in an acute setting, they may be more interested in a 7-day service with a same-day or even 4-hour response than they are with lengthy, detailed communication assessments, which might be the place of the community service. As regards process, I felt my remit was quite wide, so a good idea at the beginning was just to get ideas down on paper so that I had something to start to shape. It's important to define your terms, so keep in mind what your purpose and objectives are. And as I was being asked about safe staffing, in order for me to describe what outcomes were for patients in terms of safety, I had to think about what unsafe looked like. In terms of resources and contacts, think about who can help you. I actually started by contacting college to ask whether anybody else in the wake of Francis had been asked the same question. But use other speech therapy managers, use people in your hub, use other AHP managers in your trust. And think about other people in your trust, perhaps the data managers, finance, contracts, librarians. There's lots of people who can help you out. And of course, there's lots of resources on Royal College website, the Matrix report, management toolkit, leadership videos, and HCPC and Royal College guidelines. In terms of data you might use national data around incidence and prevalence of certain conditions like stroke or dementia, or you can use guidance where speech therapy is specifically mentioned, perhaps like the improving outcomes guidance on head and neck cancer. You might choose to use your population data, so find out what your local joint strategic needs assessment says about your population, and that can give you some kind of indication about what you can expect in terms of trends and demands for speech therapy. And then of course there's your trust data, so your trust will publish things like quality accounts and annual reports and outcomes of CQC visits, and they can all be quite helpful. Getting down to speech therapy more specifically, there's a small amount of national documentation around staffing, around stroke and neuro rehab, and I compared that to my staff sessions to show the gap. You could benchmark either nationally, or I chose to use a local trust of a similar size with multi-site, and I presented staff to bed ratios in both trusts. And of course, I presented quite a lot of information on staffing, as you might expect, and I presented that in a number of ways. So I looked at banding as a percentage of our total workforce, I looked at spread, and I looked at daily capacity in terms of actual number of hands that I had per session, per specialty, per site, and I timetabled it in terms of days of the week and hours of the day. In terms of cost savings, I took David's idea and I looked at where we were doing the work that was previously done by doctors, and I actually costed the number of consultant sessions we'd saved a week. As my remit was safety, I highlighted situations where I thought the service was less safe, so perhaps weekends or where there were single-handed services or where demand consistently exceeded capacity. You can use your incidents and complaints, and although none of us like complaints, they can be very good at getting your service on the radar, and it's something that commissioners certainly will take note of. There's lots of Royal College guidance, as you will know, and I looked at particular things like some of the professional guidelines and some of the guidance around supervision, and I highlighted where I thought our service was less than best practice. As regards job planning, I used David's idea in the broadest sense to show that we had little time around CPD and non-patient contact time. And I highlighted areas where we had no service at all, and I explained what that meant in terms of outcome for the patient. As regards 7-day working, I showed what effect that would have on weekday services if there was no investment. And another useful approach can be if you can get funding for a pilot or even staff to volunteer on a short-term basis, that you're able to collect data which can then be used to support a business case in the future. Our internal professional standards are something that all services have within our trust to show how we contribute to patient flow and meeting access targets. And so obviously I was able to produce the data from my service. This slide summarises the main aspects of workforce performance as it relates to the quality and safety of service provision. So I won't go through each of those, but I talked about each in turn as to what that meant. So for example, for sickness, I could show that we had quite a resilient and robust service that had low levels of sickness. However, that even 1 or 2 days absence, particularly when somebody else was on annual leave, was enough to tipple a fragile service. And you could do the same with showing about locums threatening safety if you've got maternity leave or carrying vacancies, etc. As regards actually producing your business case, it is important to use a business case format, as I've said before, thinking of the language you've used, perhaps an executive summary and a strategic context. Think about how you're going to present your data. There's lots of different ways in terms of graphs, tables, perhaps RAG rating or pairs of hands, as I said. So think about what you're trying to present and which method might be the most powerful. You do need to give a balanced view, and I'm sure all of you out there would be desperate to say how short-staffed you are, and if you aren't careful, you can focus very much on your shortcomings. You need to focus also on showing your service value and its outcomes so that they might hopefully want to invest further. Don't just include information on what your staff cost and your numbers of contacts, but the impact of what you do on patients. And of course, if you can find a critical friend or two to look at your paper, that's really helpful. So I had 2 critical friends, team leaders in my service, and David actually looked over my paper and asked questions for clarity, accuracy and detail. And that allowed me to really hone in my final document. So my final slide is to say see opportunities, listen and watch what your trust is doing and commissioners are doing. Make sure that you network and are connected in your organisation. So be part of the leadership. Get involved outside of speech therapy and know your key players. You need to build your reputation as someone who is helpful, reliable, constructive, good-humoured and who contributes to the organisation. And you need to know your service well, not just as a manager, but on what's happening on the ground. Be resilient and expect knockbacks, and you have to pick yourself up and try again. And finally, I think it's useful to be a step ahead, and when you've finished a piece of work, to begin to think, what next? What new data do I need to collect, or what new themes or trends are happening in my trust that might be something I need to be thinking about now? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Sue. And we have had a question come in, which we'll pose if we have time at the end of the presentation. So I'd now like to pass it over to Diane Payne. Over to you.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everybody. My slides are going to be very much my personal reflections on the key factors that I think were influential in some of the successful business cases that I have presented over time. Very quickly, everybody has to have their basic set of data, the usual stuff, activity, finance, response times, etc., etc. But from my point of view, other things that were particularly helpful were this selection of specialist tools. And in particular, I think the one at the bottom left, the service level risk assessment, wherein we used the risk assessment matrix that belonged to our trust and is pretty standard, I'm sure, but where we plotted risk against our current level of service when it was fully resourced and demand was stable, and then plotted risk against unplanned leave, planned leave, unexpected increase in demand, and in effect it also became a business continuity tool wherein we put in our management responses to those changes in demand and capacity. As Sue said, complaints and incidents are hugely important in being able to provide data and information, not least because they provide the patient voice, which sometimes is difficult to get hold of in this particular area. Models of care and workforce modelling, there's a lot that can be said about that. A lot of work goes into them, and a lot of it is part of what Sue has been talking about. For me, defining the problem, the key things were to look at trends, looking back at where we had come from, and looking at changes in terms of the nature of the problem. Was it growing? Was it stable? So not then looking back, but then looking around at the current situation and looking to the future, anticipating challenges and pressures and changes in structure that were on the horizon, but framing all of that in words that reflect the impact on the patient and their care. One of my reflections on the most important aspect of all this is to think about who it is I was trying to influence. In different circumstances, it was different people. I make no apology for comparing this to a type of sales, really, because the person you're influencing is your customer in this instance. And if your customer is somebody who is looking for apples and bananas because that's what they miss, and you're trying to get them to buy socks and pants, you're going to have a hard sell on your hands. So understanding who your customer is critical here. If you are talking about inpatients, then your customer is most likely going to be your own organisation. If it's outpatients and community, then we're talking about commissioners. But who are you influencing? You need to understand the world of your customer. If this is your divisional manager, you need to know what their problems are. You need to know a bit about them, their preferred style of doing things. Are they somebody who likes the big picture, likes to make quick decisions, or do they like the detail? You need to know that because you may well be presenting to them one-to-one. But above all else, you need to know what problems they're trying to solve at the moment, what their pressures are and what they're trying to achieve, so that you can be talking from the same sheet. When you present the case, it's really important that your argument is very clear. If you are presenting one-to-one, and this is just not a paper being sent in, but you get the opportunity for a meeting, you need to recognise that you might have half an hour of their diary booked out in theory, but in reality, it might only be 5 minutes. So it needs to be clear. You need to be able to get to the point. You need to be able to present it in headlines and have your elevator pitch ready. The important thing about your case is that the decision making is most likely to happen in the conversation that follows the case, because there will be questions to ask. So you need to allow time for those questions, because that's where the magic can happen. And if you are talking on a one-to-one basis, the whole concept of building rapport with the person that you're talking to is enormously important, because in rapport, basically what you're trying to do is make sure that you are really connecting with them, that you are using the vocabulary that they use, so that you're talking about the same thing, that you are genuine in the way you are presenting your case, that you show that you're concerned by listening to them, by making sure that they understand that you're working on the same problem. And another soft skill is preparing yourself before you go into that setting. If you are anxious, if you are fearful, if you are resigned to failure, all of that will influence the way you come across in your presentation. And to be able to understand how you react to those situations in general and understand your own emotions and perceiving how you are feeling at the time and managing those emotions so that they don't prevent you from listening, they don't prevent you from being perceptive, that they make you defensive. Those are all important things. But equally, emotions can be used to good effect, because your passion, your commitment, your enthusiasm, your loyalty, all of those things will come across, and you can utilize those to add a lot of color to the facts that you're presenting. One example of a business case that I put forward and was successful was where we, having just merged as two organizations into one large foundation trust, were in a position where we had the opportunity of redesigning our speech and language therapy service. And in redesigning, there were going to be cost savings. And my case was to reinvest those savings into additional staffing, which then went on to result in additional outputs. And so the key things in that case, I felt, were the fact that there was a risk assessment of the current levels of service, so that was clear, that we had benchmarked, that we had costed a range of options, not just one, and that we had identified what the actual impact on patient care would be with all of those options. And on my slide, I've missed this off, but the timing of this was key, because we were a new organisation, had a new divisional manager and a new finance manager, and they were looking for people who were able to present something with positivity, with creativity. They needed to be assured of financial awareness. Nobody knew me, but they could see that there was some recognition of costs, of pressures, but also value for money. And the belief in the value of the service was absolutely key, I think, too, in selling that case. And finally, a more recent one, which was a harder sell, where inpatient services were struggling hugely because of the increase in demand over a 5-year period with no additional resource. The data was clear. There was facts about capacity, about demand, referral rates, response times, impact on the quality and performance. But I think the biggest thing there was planning that conversation, because what made the difference was anticipating the arguments that the divisional manager was going to give me as to why they shouldn't invest. And that meant that I needed to have my facts at my fingertips and anticipate the answers to those questions. That meant perseverance and belief again in what I was selling. And so all of those things and everything that Sue and David has just said, I do feel were absolutely key in everything that was done. Thank you.
Thank you very much to all our panelists, to David, Sue and Diane. We're now coming to the Q&A session of the webinar. We did have some questions that were submitted prior to the webinar, and so we will take some of those first. I'm aware that colleagues might wish to refer back to their slides, so I think if I can help with that, that might be easier. So one of the first questions was my employing organisation and commissioners cannot agree the scope of the speech and language therapy service. It is not a priority for my employing organisation. How far can I go in directly putting the case to commissioners? Sue, do you want to take that first?
Okay, thank you, Kamini. I think, as I said in my presentation, that there are many adult services that have an undefined service spec with no boundaries, and therefore, by definition, there is a no scope. As regards approaching your commissioners, then there are lots of speech therapy managers or their managers who do speak directly to commissioners. But if that's something that's not allowed as such in your organisation, then you need to find out who it is in your organisation that is speaking to the commissioners and be able to influence them. As a lead, you can monitor, and I presume you do monitor, activity and changes and trends, and you can flag those up with perhaps your contracting department, and it may be it is them that links with the commissioners. Also, if there are any complaints around the particular service or complaints in relation to speech therapy, then that is another way of managing to link in with commissioners. If there aren't any complaints, sometimes to them it is not a real concern and they may be more interested in focusing on other areas. I think if you're drawing a blank in those areas, the other thing you can do is you might need to recognise as a manager of a service when your service becomes unsafe or untenable, and then you might need to consult with a whole host of people in your trust and with the commissioners indirectly at least, and you may need to do some option appraisals about what you can do with the service you have available. And I think Diane's point around managing to put the speech therapy service onto the trust risk register can be another valuable way of beginning to link in around commissioners.
Thanks very much, Sue. I'm going to go to the next question, and I'm just going to flick back to the slides that David had, which are around skill mix, because that's the next question was about balancing leadership and expertise, i.e. highly specialist roles, with skill mix. So I'm just going to go back to this slide, David. If you could just give a bit more information around this, that would be great.
Yeah, there's a lot more that we can do on describing what we've developed as advanced job planning. There's quite a lot of detail on this slide, but you'll be able to look at it when we refer back to it in a week's time. But essentially, for the specialist, that could be someone who's a specialist all the time, or a clinician who's specialist some of the time, is looking at the 4 components of activity. And essentially, the column on the left is where you directly do direct clinical care. There's a patient or client in front of you, where you do essentially direct clinical care, but it's sort of immediately supportive, patient administration and so forth. Then 2 other categories called supporting professional activity, SPA. That's where you're developing yourself as a specialist, which Sue referred to in her remarks, and where you're doing that to develop others, a core role of the specialist. Now, all of this language is used for job planning for docs, and we deliberately adopted it because we know that organisations are already familiar with it, obviously in the medical NHS setting, but clearly this could work in others as well. There's no right answer. All of this needs to have assumptions and evidence where possible, and if you don't have it, to have a guess, but ultimately it could be challenged. But looking at what proportion of my time do I allocate to these things, and you'll see on the other slide a list of sort of key clinical impact features. It's more than just bed days, all the sorts of things that, yes, this slide here, that at the bottom there, the sorts of things that you clinicians do that can have an effect on the efficiency and effectiveness of the service. Thanks, Kamini.
Thanks very much, David. I don't know if either Diane or Sue wanted to come into the next bit. I think, Diane, there was a question about how to respond when the evidence or guidance you present is referred to by decision makers as guidance only.
Thank you, Kamini. Yes, I was reading through this one. What struck me was the fact that actually guidance is guidance only, and in this instance, not being exactly clear what it is, but it may well be that that was not going to be the most effective lever in presenting a business case. Because if you are a decision maker, quite often you're balancing quite a number of very difficult decisions, limited resources across a very wide range of areas. And so actually if it is guidance, then it is only guidance. My thought is that a more powerful tool there might be to talk about risk, because risk there is real. It's about what's happening today, and it's the currency that any decision maker is going to have to use, because that is actually what they're balancing as different risks. So you have to talk about the same thing, and you have to talk about risk. And when you talk about risk, then you're establishing the need. And there are times when everybody has to acknowledge that maybe the level of risk that your service presents is real, but actually much less than the risk that other services are presenting, in which case you then either need to readdress the way you're presenting your case, or actually recognise that now is not the right time. And I think that was something that Sue mentioned in her presentation, and it's something about timing and opportunity and waiting for the right moment.
Okay, one final question was about making a business case in terms of savings made in cost avoidance when there's little evidence to support it. As part of the question, the person has commented that they're constantly asked for bed days saved. In addition, Sue was specifically asked a question about more detail on how she mapped staffing against number of beds. But if, Diane, you could just tell us a little bit about what you think about the being asked for bed days saved, and then I'll come back to you, Sue.
Bed days saved for me is something I would want to come back to the person who's asking for that and try and find from them, by asking questions, what that represents for them, because bed days saved is one form of currency, and if they're applying that to every area, then they're very fixed in their thinking. And I would want to take them back to, what does bed days saved mean to you? Does that mean saving money, cheaper cost of treatment? What is it? Because you need to find a currency that you can then relate to and link into, and it won't necessarily be bed days.
Okay, and just to just to pick up on the other point is it wasn't really a very clever way I did it. I just looked at literally my whole time equivalents, and I looked at the number of beds in my trust. I took out paediatric beds because at that point we weren't providing a paediatric service, and other services of women's and children's, antenatal wards, etc. And I did exactly the same in the other organisations. So all trusts publish number of beds they've got and under which specialty. So I literally looked at the number of beds that we provided a service to in principle and the staff I had, and did the same in the other trust and made a direct comparison.
That's lovely. Thank you very much, Sue. So that concludes our webinar for this afternoon. And just to say a very big thank you to David, Sue and Diane for presenting this afternoon. As I said earlier on, the presentation will be going online in a week's time. There are a couple of questions that we didn't answer today, but we will get back to those individuals and respond to those questions in the near future. So thank you very much and goodbye.